Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something ancient, sacred, and absolutely unforgiving. Life in the wilderness with Moses during the 40-year journey through the Sinai desert. Not the neat Sunday school version with cartoon manna falling from heaven. The raw, gritty truth of what it meant to be part of a massive exodus, wandering through one of Earth's most hostile environments with nothing but primitive tools and divine promises. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on this spiritual journey. Now, turn off all the lights. The screen will also dim in a moment to help you relax as you listen to tonight's story. Let's ease into our biblical journey together. Now you're in the ancient Sinai Peninsula, roughly 300 years ago. The vast, merciless desert surrounds you, not in Bible illustrations or movies, but in smell, sound, and touch. The good news: you're part of the chosen people, witnesses to divine miracles. The bad news: you probably won't survive until sunset. The air around you dry as bone, hot as flame, and filled with fine sand that coats your throat with every breath. Your shelter isn't a climate-controlled home. It's just a simple goat hair tent that barely blocks the sun's assault. No air conditioning, no refrigeration, just the relentless heat that makes your sweat evaporate before it even forms on your skin. The sounds aren't traffic or notifications. It's the constant wind whistling through rocky crags, the distant bleating of goats, the murmur of thousands of people shuffling through sand, and the occasional cry of someone succumbing to the elements. This isn't a Bible storybook anymore. This is survival in one of Earth's most unforgiving landscapes. And you're already failing at it. The Sinai Peninsula stretches before you, a brutal tapestry of geological violence. Mountains thrust upward from cracked earth, their jagged silhouettes cutting into the relentlessly blue sky. Valleys of naked stone bake under the sun, absorbing heat all day just to radiate it back at night, giving you no respite. Vast plains of gravel and sand extend to the horizon, the surface rippled by wind patterns that seem beautiful until you realize they're constantly shifting, erasing any hope of maintaining your bearings. This isn't the smooth, photogenic sand dunes of your Instagram desert fantasies. The Sinai is primarily a rock desert, what geologists call a hamada. The ground beneath your feet isn't soft, golden sand, but rather a mixture of hard, packed dirt, loose gravel, and razor-sharp rocks that slice through the thin leather of your primitive sandals. Your feet are already blistering, having walked less than an hour. Modern hiking boots with cushioned soles and ankle support. Forget it. You're wearing the Bronze Age equivalent of dollar-store flip-flops, except they're made from roughly tanned goat leather that's already shrinking and hardening in the dry heat. The vastness overwhelms your senses. Modern humans rarely experience true emptiness. We're surrounded by buildings, streets, other people, the constant hum of civilization. But here, nothing but silence and space punctuated by the sounds of your struggling caravan. The psychological weight of this emptiness is something your modern mind isn't equipped to handle. There's no distraction, no way to scroll away the discomfort, no quick fix for the growing panic as you realize just how far you are from anything resembling safety. Eases are rare, miraculous convergences of underground water, shade, and the possibility of rest. But they're separated by days or weeks of travel, and the knowledge of where they lie is specialized information. Without Moses and the tribal elders who understand this landscape, you would wander aimlessly until death. Your smartphone's GPS, useless. Your ability to call for help, non-existent. Your only technology is what you or someone else can carry, and everything is precious beyond measure. The colors around you aren't the vibrant palette of your daily life. The Sinai wears a limited wardrobe, the relentless blue of the sky, the searing white of midday sun on stone, the endless tans and browns of rock and sand. occasionally interrupted by the shocking green of desert plants that somehow cling to life in this unforgiving place. There's beauty here, yes, but it's the beauty of extremes, of survival against all odds, not the comfortable aesthetics of your climate-controlled existence. Your fellow Israelites move around you, thousands of them. Men, women, children, the elderly, all trudging through this hostile environment. Modern Exodus stories often gloss over the sheer logistics of moving what biblical scholars estimate to be between 20,000 and 2 million people through a desert. Think about that for a moment. The largest estimates would make this the size of a major modern city, all walking through a landscape that can barely support a few nomadic tribes with no infrastructure, no supply chain, no water treatment facilities. The Bible describes this as a divine miracle. And looking around at the scale of this human movement, you understand why natural explanations fall short. The smell is something your sanitized modern life hasn't prepared you for. Thousands of unwashed human bodies concentrated in the desert heat create an odor that's almost visible. No daily showers, no deodorant, no perfumed soaps. Just the sharp tang of human sweat, the acrid scent of fear, the earthiness of animals walking alongside you, sheep, goats, the occasional ox. The waste from all these humans and animals has to go somewhere, and the rudimentary sanitation practices of the time are barely containing the public health disaster that constantly threatens to erupt. You instinctively reach for water, but your bottle isn't there. Instead, you have a sewn animal skin container, likely goat or sheep bladder, that holds perhaps 2 liters if completely full. Yours isn't full. The water within is warm, slightly cloudy, and tastes of leather and the natural oils used to seal it. It's nothing like the clean, cold, filtered water you're accustomed to, but your parched throat doesn't care anymore. Every sip is a calculation. How far until the next water source? How much do you need to function? How much can you spare for your crying child? Water discipline is your new religion. The weight of your possessions pulls at your shoulders. Modern backpacking equipment distributes weight efficiently across your body with padded straps and ergonomic design. Here, you're carrying your life on your back with crude rope straps that dig into your skin and awkward bundles that throw off your balance with every step. The most precious metals on Earth right now aren't gold or silver, they're copper and bronze. The materials that make tools possible. A simple copper knife represents weeks or months of labor value. You guard your few metal implements with your life, because replacing them isn't just expensive. It might be impossible. Children cry somewhere behind you, their wails cutting through the dry air. Modern parenting has the luxury of climate control, ready food, and relative safety. Desert parenting is something else entirely. How do you soothe a child who's genuinely suffering from heat, thirst, hunger, and exhaustion? How do you explain to them why they had to leave the relative stability of Egyptian slavery for this uncertain journey? The mothers and fathers around you aren't failing at parenting. They're performing miracles, just keeping their children alive. The sun isn't your friend anymore. That warm, life-giving star has transformed into an enemy that pounds you with radiation and heat. Without sunscreen, your skin is already reddening, beginning the cycle of burn, peel, burn again that will become your constant companion. Head coverings aren't just a cultural or religious choice here, they're essential survival gear. The Israelites wrapped their heads in cloth, not only to keep the sun off, but to trap a small amount of moisture near their skin and hair. Your uncovered head throbs as the first signs of heat stroke begin to manifest. The temperature is the most immediate threat to your survival. During summer in the Sinai, daytime temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees C. But that's the ambient temperature measured in shade, something that barely exists here. The surface temperature of the rocks and sand beneath your feet can reach 160 degrees Fahrenheit 71 degrees C, hot enough to cause second-degree burns through your thin sandals. You're living in an oven, and your body is the thing being cooked. Water doesn't just quench thirst in this environment. It's the difference between life and death in hours, not days. The human body usually requires about 2-3 liters of water daily under normal conditions. In the desert heat, performing physical activity like walking, you need 8-10 liters minimum, possibly more. The entire Israelite camp requires tens of thousands of liters daily just to survive. Finding, carrying, and distributing this water is a logistical challenge that would tax a modern military operation, let alone a Bronze Age tribal society. The biblical accounts of water miracles, Moses striking the rock at Horeb, the springs at Elim, take on new significance when you realize they're not just spiritual narratives, but survival necessities. And now, as the morning progresses into midday, you're experiencing the true ferocity of desert heat. There's nowhere to hide, no refuge from the sun that has transformed from giver of life to dealer of death. The Israelites around you have a rhythm to their movement. They travel in the coolness of early morning and late afternoon, seeking whatever shade they can find during the brutal midday hours. You didn't know this rhythm yet, and now you're caught in the open as the sun reaches its zenith. The temperature climbs relentlessly. Without modern measuring tools, you can only gauge it by its effects on your body. Your vision begins to waver, the horizon dancing in heat mirages that cruelly simulate the water your body craves. Sweat no longer beads on your skin. It evaporates instantly, leaving salt crystals that irritate and chafe. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid as your body attempts to cool itself, but the air you inhale feels like it's coming from an open furnace. This heat is different from anything you've experienced. It's not the humid heat of a sauna or tropical climate where sweat clings to your skin. Desert heat is a predator that actively pulls moisture from your body through every available means: your breath, your skin, even your eyes that are now dry and scratchy as the moisture in them evaporates too quickly for your tear ducts to replace. Your thoughts become sluggish. Modern medicine has a term for what you're experiencing: hypothermia, the opposite of hypothermia. Your core body temperature is rising above the narrow range where human biology functions properly. Above 140 Fs or 40 degrees C, proteins begin to denature, cellular processes falter, and your brain literally cannot think straight. The confusion you're feeling isn't weakness, it's your brain cooking inside your skull. Around you, the more experienced Israelites are taking what precautions they can. They wet cloths with precious water and place them on their heads and necks. They seek the meager shade of rocks, or gather beneath the portable shelters that some have managed to erect. They move slowly, conserving energy and the water within their bodies. They know what you're just learning, that hurrying, panicking, or fighting the desert only hastens death. But the heat isn't the only environmental challenge. As midday passes and the afternoon wears on, another feature of desert life introduces itself: the wind. It starts as a welcome relief, a slight stirring of the superheated air, but it quickly strengthens. And you realize this isn't the gentle breeze of comfort, but the harbinger of a new torment. The wind picks up loose sand and dust, carrying it at speeds that transform these tiny particles into abrasive projectiles. The first gust catches you unprepared. Sand strikes your exposed skin like thousands of miniature needles, finding its way into your eyes, your nose, your mouth. You instinctively turn away, but there's no escaping it completely. The experienced travelers around you are already wrapping additional layers around their faces, leaving only narrow slits for their eyes. They pull children close, creating human windbreaks with their bodies. The animals bleat in distress, turning their backs to the wind by instinct. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous in ways your modern life hasn't prepared you for. Sand inhalation can cause respiratory issues that, without medical treatment, develop into infections. Sand in your eyes can scratch the cornea, leading to pain and potential blindness in a world without antibiotics or ophthalmologists. The constant abrasion of sand against skin creates raw patches that quickly become infected in the unsanitary conditions of desert travel. The wind carries something else too, sound. In the desert's strange acoustics, it moans and whistles as it passes over rock formations and through narrow valleys. It's an eerie, unsettling sound that primitive peoples around the world have incorporated into their mythology. You understand now why ancient cultures attributed personalities and intentions to the wind. In this empty landscape, it feels alive, malevolent, hunting you personally. As the wind increases, visibility decreases. The horizon that seemed so distant this morning now closes in around you as airborne sand and dust create a haze that might stretch for miles or just a few hundred feet. You have no way to tell. Landmarks disappear, and suddenly the concept of being lost takes on existential significance. In the modern world, being lost is an inconvenience easily solved with technology or by finding another person to ask for directions. In the desert, being lost is a death sentence executed over hours or days of suffering. Moses and the tribal leaders have systems for keeping the massive group together. Signals, designated pathways, human chains of communication. You witness the sophisticated social organization that makes this seemingly impossible journey feasible. Modern humans rarely experience the necessity of absolute cooperation for survival. Here, individualism is death. The group must function as a single organism, distributing resources, sharing loads, supporting the vulnerable. The biblical emphasis on community isn't just a spiritual ideal, it's a survival strategy honed in the crucible of desert existence. As the afternoon wind dies down, you get your first taste of another desert phenomenon that will soon become intimately familiar: the dramatic temperature shift. While daytime temperatures in the Sinai can exceed 100 degrees F or 38 degrees C, nighttime temperatures, especially in the higher elevations, can drop to near freezing, even in summer. This temperature swing of 50 degrees F or 28 degrees C or more in a single day is something your body isn't designed to handle easily. The first hint of this coming change is a subtle shift in the light. The harsh white glare of midday softens into a more golden hue as the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon. The shadows, nearly non-existent at noon, now stretch across the rocky ground, creating patterns that are both beautiful and disorienting. The experienced desert travelers increase their pace slightly, knowing they need to reach suitable camping grounds before darkness falls completely. Your body, which has been fighting desperately against overheating all day, will soon face the opposite challenge. The thin clothing that seemed insufficient against the sun will prove even more inadequate against the coming cold. The sweat that has dried repeatedly on your skin has left salt residue that will make the cold feel even more biting. Your depleted energy reserves will struggle to generate enough heat to maintain your core temperature. When the desert surrenders its stored heat to the night sky, the transition happens with startling speed. As the sun touches the western horizon, the change in temperature is almost immediate. The air that burned your lungs just hours ago now carries a chill that raises goosebumps on your arms. Your sweat, dampened clothing, which offered minimal relief during the day, now becomes a liability, drawing heat from your body as the moisture cools. The desert doesn't gently ease between extremes. It slams from one to another with a violence that makes your modern adaptability seem pathetically inadequate. Darkness falls differently here than in your world of artificial light. It doesn't gradually dim as streetlights flicker on to hold back the night. Desert darkness is absolute, a primal void that swallows everything. As the last rays of sun disappear, you experience darkness so complete it feels like a physical presence pressing against your eyes. The stars emerge, not the faint few you might glimpse through light, polluted urban skies, but thousands upon thousands, a blazing celestial display that both awes and terrifies with its vastness. The night brings new sounds. During the day, the desert seemed almost lifeless except for your traveling companions. Now it awakens with the rustles and calls of nocturnal creatures. Distant howls of jackals carry across the empty spaces, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Small creatures scurry across sand and stone, their movements amplified by the silence. The camp around you generates its own soundscape. The low conversations of people preparing for night, the crying of exhausted children, the occasional braying of donkeys sensing predators at the perimeter. The cold deepens as the night progresses. Within hours of sunset, the temperature has often dropped 30 degrees F, 17 degrees C or more, and it will continue falling until dawn. Your breath forms visible clouds in the air. Your fingers become stiff and clumsy as your body diverts blood away from your extremities to protect your core temperature. If you're fortunate, you have some form of outer garment, a woolen cloak perhaps, to wrap around yourself. If not, you huddle with others, sharing body heat as humans have done since time immemorial. This extreme temperature fluctuation creates unexpected physical phenomena. The rapid cooling causes rocks to contract, sometimes dramatically enough to crack with sharp gunshot, like reports that startle you from half-sleep. Dew forms heavily, even in this arid environment, as moisture in the air condenses against the rapidly cooling ground and surfaces. By morning, your outer layers will be damp with it, a cruel irony in a place defined by its dryness. Sleep comes in fitful bursts, interrupted by the cold, the hardness of the ground beneath you, the unfamiliar sounds, and the constant low-level anxiety of vulnerability. Modern humans are accustomed to the safety of locked doors and solid walls, to sleeping deeply without one part of their brain remaining vigilant for threats. Here, true unconsciousness feels dangerous. You doze rather than sleep, your body exhausted, but your primitive brain refusing to fully surrender its guard. The morning arrives with the same abruptness as the evening chill. The first rays of sun trigger an immediate warming. Within minutes of sunrise, you can feel the heat building again, beginning another cycle of extreme temperature variation. The dew that collected overnight evaporates quickly, a brief moment of humidity in the dry air. Experienced travelers are already moving, knowing they must cover ground before the day's worst heat arrives. This pattern, brutally hot days, surprisingly cold nights, the constant swing between extremes, isn't a temporary discomfort, but your new normal. The human body can eventually acclimate to consistent conditions, even challenging ones, but these daily extremes prevent full adaptation. You're constantly physiologically off balance, your body never allowed to settle into homeostasis. This chronic stress accelerates fatigue, weakens immunity, and clouds judgment, all deadly liabilities in a survival situation. And these are just the typical conditions. The Sinai also delivers weather events of astonishing intensity. Dust storms can appear with little warning, especially during the transitional seasons. These aren't the cinematic haboobs of Hollywood desert movies, but something more insidious, days of relentlessly blowing fine particles that infiltrate everything. Your food becomes gritty, your water silty, your eyes and lungs irritated beyond any relief you can provide. During winter months, the higher elevations of the Sinai can even see snow, a surreal sight in this landscape associated with heat. More common are flash floods, perhaps the desert's deadliest surprise. The hard-packed ground, baked for months under the sun, can't absorb sudden rainfall. Water sheets across the surface, gathering in widest dry riverbeds that transform from dusty depressions to raging torrents in minutes. Entire groups of travelers have perished when caught in these unpredictable floods, their bodies found miles downstream, if found at all. The Israelites, having lived in Egypt for generations, would have retained some desert survival knowledge, but many would have been as unprepared as you for the Sinai's particular challenges. The biblical narrative acknowledges this unpreparedness indirectly through stories of complaints, of longing to return to Egypt, of questioning why Moses had led them to day in the wilderness. These weren't spiritual failings so much as the natural human response to extreme physiological stress, yet survival was possible, difficult, demanding absolute attention to basic necessities, but possible. Water, obviously, was the most immediate and constant concern. The biblical account describes water miracles at specific locations, Moses striking the rock at Horeb, the springs at Elim, but these would have been supplemented by careful water discipline and knowledge. The Israelites would have become experts at finding natural water sources, seeps where underground water emerged, seasonal streams, oases known to regional travelers. They would have learned to dig for water in dried riverbeds where moisture might remain just below the surface. They would have constructed catchment systems to collect dew and the rare rainfall. Every drop would be precious, carefully rationed and protected. Water storage and transport presented their own challenges. The most common containers were made from animal skins, sheep or goat bladders, and stomachs treated to form watertight vessels. These were functional but imperfect. They imparted flavors to the water, might leak if improperly sealed, and deteriorated over time, requiring constant maintenance and eventual replacement. The logistics of carrying enough water for thousands of people would have required thousands of these containers, representing a significant portion of the community's material wealth. The quality of water was another concern. Without modern understanding of pathogens or methods of purification, waterborne illness would have been common. Some natural antimicrobial substances were available. Certain plant extracts and alcoholic fermentation could provide limited protection, but dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases would have been constant companions. The biblical laws regarding cleanliness and camp sanitation weren't just religious rituals but practical public health measures, essential for a large group living in close quarters under harsh conditions. Next to water, food presented the greatest ongoing challenge. The biblical account describes two miraculous food sources, manna that appeared each morning and quail that arrived in massive flocks. These stories have been variously interpreted as purely supernatural provisions, as exaggerated accounts of natural phenomena, or as poetic descriptions of resourceful foraging. Whatever their historical basis, the narrative acknowledges the fundamental problem. The Sinai could not naturally support such a large population through normal means. In reality, the Israelites would have relied on a combination of strategies for sustenance. They brought livestock, sheep, goats, and some cattle from Egypt, providing a mobile food source in the form of milk, occasional meat, and blood, mixed with milk as a nutritious drink in many nomadic cultures. These animals would have eaten desert vegetation insufficient for human consumption, effectively converting inedible plants into human, usable calories. They would have brought some grain stores from Egypt, carefully rationed over the journey. They would have foraged for desert plants with edible parts, roots, stems, fruits, and seeds adapted to arid conditions. They would have harvested what animal proteins were available, insects like locusts, specifically mentioned as kosher in Levitical law, small game, eggs from ground, nesting birds, and whatever fish might be found in the rare permanent water sources. Food preservation was critical. Without refrigeration, techniques like drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting would have been essential for creating stable food reserves. The hot, dry climate would have actually facilitated some preservation methods. Meat and fish could be cut into thin strips and rapidly dried in the sun to create primitive jerky with a long shelf life. Seeds and grains could be parched over fire to extend their storage capability. The reality of desert nutrition would bear little resemblance to modern dietary ideals. Meals would be irregular, portions carefully measured, variety limited by what was available rather than what was preferred. Periods of relative abundance would alternate with times of near starvation. The biblical accounts of food complaints of the people weeping for meat and remembering the fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic of Egypt reflect not just spiritual weakness, but the genuine physiological and psychological strain of dietary deprivation. Beyond the immediate necessities of water and food, shelter presented another survival requirement. Modern humans spend roughly 90% of their lives inside buildings, protected from environmental extremes. In the desert with Moses, shelter was minimal, portable, and often inadequate against the elements. The primary dwelling was the tent, likely made from woven goat hair stretched over poles, similar to the black tents still used by Bedouin peoples today. These provided some shade during day and some insulation at night, but they were far from comfortable by modern standards. The material was heavy, difficult to keep clean, prone to harboring insects and parasites, and required significant maintenance. Setting up and breaking down camp was labor-intensive, particularly challenging for the elderly, ill, or those with young children. Inside these tents, furnishings would be minimal, perhaps woven mats for sitting and sleeping, some skin or ceramic containers for storage, a central space for a small cooking fire when fuel was available. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Extended families would share a single tent with minimal separation between different age groups or married couples. The concept of personal space, so valued in modern Western culture, would have been an unimaginable luxury. The biblical tabernacle, the portable sanctuary constructed according to divine specifications, represented the most sophisticated structure in the Israelite camp. With its wooden framework, layered coverings, and designated spaces, it would have stood in stark contrast to the simple dwellings surrounding it. Its construction and transportation required specialized skills and dedicated resources, demonstrating the community's commitment to maintaining religious practice even under extreme conditions. Clothing in the desert served multiple functions beyond modesty. It provided crucial protection from sun during day and cold at night. The ideal desert garment covered most of the body while allowing air circulation, was light, colored to reflect sunlight, and could be adjusted for different conditions. The Israelites would have worn simple tunics and mantles of wool or linen, with head coverings essential for sun protection. Footwear would have been basic sandals of leather, offering minimal protection and requiring frequent repair. The maintenance of these basic necessities consumed most waking hours. Modern life, with its automated systems and convenient services, leaves time for leisure, education, and specialized work. Desert survival leaves little surplus time or energy. Locating water, preparing food, maintaining shelter and clothing, caring for livestock, and then packing everything to move to the next location. These tasks would have occupied virtually every moment, not spent actually traveling. This constant labor fell disproportionately on women. While biblical narratives focus primarily on male leaders and their activities, the daily work of survival would have been largely female domain. Women would have been responsible for food preparation, water collection, childcare, textile production and repair, and many aspects of livestock management. These essential contributions rarely appear in the foreground of sacred texts, but were the foundation that made the journey possible. Children entered the labor force early by necessity. Modern childhood, with its focus on education and play, would have been an unaffordable luxury. By age 5 or 6, children would have significant responsibilities, watching younger siblings, gathering fuel, helping with animals, carrying water. The biblical narrative mentions little ones among the travelers, but doesn't detail the particular hardships they endured. Child mortality would have been high, with disease, accidents, and exposure claiming many young lives despite parents' best efforts. The elderly faced their own challenges. Desert conditions are particularly hard on aging bodies. The physical demands of daily travel, the extremes of temperature, limited nutrition, and lack of medical care would have made advanced age rare. Those who did reach elder status would have contributed through knowledge, rather than physical labor. Their experience of routes, water sources, weather patterns, and tribal history would have been invaluable resources for the community's survival. Hygiene and sanitation presented ongoing difficulties with serious health implications. The biblical laws include detailed instructions for human waste disposal outside the camp, hand-washing rituals, and isolation of those with potentially contagious conditions. These regulations weren't just ceremonial, but practical public health measures, essential for preventing disease outbreaks that could devastate a concentrated population with no access to medical treatment. Personal cleanliness was difficult to maintain with limited water. Modern humans are accustomed to using gallons of water daily for bathing, but in the desert, full body washing would have been a rare luxury. What water could be spared for hygiene would focus on hands, face, and feet, the parts most exposed to contamination and most involved in daily activities. Body odor wasn't a social concern, but a universal condition, only notable when someone's smell indicated possible illness. Disease was a constant threat under these conditions. The biblical plagues that occasionally struck the Israelites likely included naturally occurring infectious outbreaks, exacerbated by crowded conditions, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and stress. Without antibiotics, antivirals, or modern surgical techniques, even minor infections or injuries could become life-threatening. Recovery depended largely on the body's natural healing abilities, supported by what limited herbal remedies and traditional treatments were available. The psychological impact of these harsh conditions cannot be overstated. Modern humans experience stress primarily as an internal, often social phenomenon, largely disconnected from immediate survival concerns. Desert stress was existential and unrelenting, the constant awareness that death was potentially hours away if water ran out, if shelter failed, if injury prevented travel, if food stores depleted before reaching the next source. This chronic stress affects cognitive function. Decision-making becomes impaired, focus narrows, long-term planning gives way to immediate concerns. The biblical accounts of complaint, rebellion, and poor choices among the Israelites reflect not just spiritual failures, but the predictable cognitive effects of prolonged environmental stress. Even Moses himself, described as the meekest man who ever lived, eventually snapped under the pressure, striking the rock in anger, rather than speaking to it as instructed. Sleep deprivation would have compounded these effects. Quality sleep requires certain conditions: relative comfort, security, moderate temperature, minimal disruption. None of these were consistently available in the desert journey. The resulting chronic fatigue would have further undermined cognitive function, emotional regulation, and immune response, creating a downward spiral of deteriorating physical and mental health. Yet somehow, according to the biblical narrative, the Israelites survived 40 years in these conditions. The text attributes this to divine intervention, miraculous provision of water and food, supernatural guidance through pillar of cloud and fire, divine protection from elements and enemies. Whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, these accounts acknowledge the fundamental reality. Long-term desert survival for such a large group required something beyond ordinary human capability. The Sinai Desert isn't just harsh in its climate and scarce in its resources, it's actively dangerous in ways that modern humans, protected by technology and infrastructure, rarely encounter. Predators, venomous creatures, toxic plants, and geological hazards create an environment where constant vigilance isn't paranoia, but necessary survival behavior. Every step taken, every rock moved, every moment of rest carries potential threats that would make your comfortable modern existence seem like an unimaginable luxury. Predators were a consistent threat, particularly to the vulnerable children, the elderly, those who strayed from the main group. Lions once roamed the Sinai Peninsula, though they would have avoided large human gatherings when possible. These weren't the romanticized creatures of nature documentaries, but efficient killers that could drag away a child or elderly person in seconds. The Israelites would have posted guards, specifically to watch for the tawny shapes moving through the scrub brush, especially during the vulnerable dawn and dusk hours when big cats are most active. More common threats came from leopards, which are nocturnal hunters comfortable in rocky terrain. Unlike the straightforward charge of lions, leopards are ambush predators, patient and stealthy. They might track the Israelite camp for days, looking for an isolated target, a wandering child, or someone who ventured too far for privacy. Their spotted coats blend perfectly with the dappled shadows of rocky outcroppings, making them nearly invisible until the moment of attack. A leopard can carry prey twice its weight up into trees or onto inaccessible rock ledges, meaning that someone taken might never be found by the grieving community. Wolves and jackals presented dangers of a different sort. Individually less threatening than big cats, they operated in packs and were bold enough to enter camps at night, particularly during lean seasons when hunger overcame their natural caution. They targeted not just humans, but the precious livestock, sheep, and goats that represented both food security and material wealth. The constant loss of animals to predation would have been a significant economic drain on the community, requiring vigilant shepherding day and night. Their howls, carrying for miles across the desert night, served as constant reminders of their presence, creating psychological stress even when physical attacks didn't materialize. Hyenas scavenged at the edges of the camp, smaller but still dangerous, with jaws powerful enough to crush bone. Unlike wolves, they were less interested in live prey than in the dead, making them both a threat and, grimly, a natural waste management system. Their eerie whooping calls at night created an unsettling soundtrack that reminded even the most devout that they were visitors in a wild land governed by ancient instincts rather than human rules. Hyenas would dig up shallow graves, meaning that proper burial required either deep excavation in hard ground or covering graves with heavy stones, both energy-intensive activities in an already exhausting environment. Beyond mammals, reptilian predators presented their own dangers. The Nile crocodile, though primarily associated with Egypt's Great River, can travel surprising distances overland and might be found in any substantial water source. A hidden crocodile could turn a life-giving oasis into a death trap, particularly for those who approached water with the carelessness born of desperate thirst. The biblical account doesn't specifically mention crocodile attacks, but the Israelites, having lived generations in Egypt, would have been well aware of this danger and approached unfamiliar water sources with appropriate caution. But the most persistent danger came from creatures too small to see from a distance yet capable of delivering death with a single encounter. The Sinai is home to numerous venomous snakes, including some of the world's deadliest. The saw-scaled viper, responsible for more human deaths than any other snake species, is perfectly camouflaged against the desert substrate. It's aggressive when threatened, delivering venom that destroys red blood cells and prevents blood clotting, causing a painful death over hours or days. These snakes are active primarily at night, when humans might step on them in darkness. Their scales make a distinctive rasping sound when the snake feels threatened, a warning that comes too late if you're already within striking distance. The black desert cobra presents another lethal threat, its neurotoxic venom capable of causing respiratory paralysis within hours. Unlike some snakes that flee from human activity, cobras may stand their ground, hooding and striking when cornered or surprised. They are attracted to human settlements, drawn by the rodents that inevitably accompany large groups of people, creating a deadly proximity that makes encounters inevitable over time. Without antivenin or respiratory support, a cobra bite was essentially a death sentence, the victim slowly suffocating as diaphragm and intercostal muscles became paralyzed. The horned viper, with its distinctive horns above each eye, burrows into sand with only its eyes and horns exposed, an ambush predator that strikes without warning. The carpet viper delivers venom that causes massive internal hemorrhaging. The Sinai burrowing asp has fangs in the back of its mouth, making it difficult to extract once it bites, allowing it to deliver larger venom doses. Each of these species represented a unique and deadly threat, with different hunting behaviors, preferred habitats, and venom effects, requiring different avoidance strategies. The biblical account includes a specific incident of widespread snakebite among the Israelites, described as divine punishment for complaints against Moses. The text mentions fiery serpents, possibly referring to the burning sensation caused by certain venoms, or perhaps to the inflammatory appearance of the wounds. The remedy described, a bronze serpent mounted on a pole, which the afflicted could look upon and live, has been interpreted both literally and symbolically, but the underlying reality of snakebite as a common danger is historically accurate. Scorpions represent another ubiquitous threat in the Sinai. The deathstalker scorpion, aptly named, is one of the world's most dangerous, its venom a cocktail of neurotoxins that can cause paralysis, convulsions, and heart failure. Yellow in color, these scorpions blend perfectly with the sandy substrate and often shelter under rocks or in crevices, exactly where humans might place hands when setting up camp or gathering firewood. Their sting is excruciatingly painful, described by survivors as feeling like being branded with hot metal. Children and the elderly are particularly vulnerable, with mortality rates approaching 50% without modern medical intervention. The fat-tailed scorpion delivers venom that attacks the cardiovascular system, potentially causing death through arrhythmia or stroke. The yellow scorpion targets the pulmonary system, causing respiratory failure. The Sinai is home to dozens of scorpion species, each presenting unique dangers. They're active primarily at night, entering tents in search of warmth or prey, hiding in clothing or bedding, creating intimate danger in what should be spaces of rest and safety. The simple act of putting on sandals in the morning or shaking out blankets before sleep becomes a potentially life-saving ritual. Less immediately lethal, but still dangerous, are the numerous spider species that inhabit the region. The Mediterranean black widow delivers venom that attacks the nervous system, causing intense pain, muscle cramping, and potential respiratory distress. Various wolf spiders, camel spiders, and tarantulas deliver painful bites that, while rarely fatal to healthy adults, can become life-threatening through secondary infection or in vulnerable individuals already weakened by malnutrition or other stressors. These arachnids are drawn to the relative shelter and prey opportunities of human camps, creating an invisible layer of risk in everyday activities. Insects present their own dangers. Scorpion flies with painful stings, centipedes whose bites deliver a burning venom, beetles that release caustic defensive chemicals capable of blistering skin. The small creatures of the desert have evolved potent protections against predation, with humans suffering as incidental victims when paths cross. Without antivenoms, antibiotics, or even basic analgesics, these encounters ranged from debilitating to deadly. Even seemingly benign insects like flies and mosquitoes acted as disease vectors, transmitting pathogens that could ravage a population with no access to modern medical treatment. Even the plants of the desert presented hidden dangers. Various euphorbias contain toxic sap that causes skin irritation and painful blisters if touched, severe gastrointestinal distress if ingested. Certain mushrooms that appear after the rare rainfall mimic edible varieties, but contain powerful toxins. Desert foraging required expert knowledge, with mistakes punished harshly through poisoning that precious water and limited medical care could do little to address. The desperate search for food in a barren landscape increased the temptation to consume unfamiliar plants, amplifying the risk of accidental poisoning. Geological hazards added another layer of danger. Flash floods, as previously mentioned, could transform dry wadis into raging torrents with little warning. Water might fall as rain miles away, invisible to those in the affected area, until a wall of water, debris, and mud rounded a bend with deadly force. The biblical account of water from the rock at Meribah describes Moses striking a rock face to produce water, a possible reference to redirecting underground water channels or breaking through thin rock barriers to access hidden water sources, activities that carried their own risks of unexpected flooding or cave-ins. Rock slides occurred on steep slopes, triggered by erosion, temperature fluctuations, or even the vibrations from thousands of people and animals moving through narrow passes. The Sinai's geological instability, sitting at the intersection of tectonic plates, makes earth tremors and minor earthquakes relatively common, potentially triggering catastrophic rockfalls with no warning. The biblical description of the ground opening to swallow rebellious Israelites might reference a natural sinkhole collapse triggered by seismic activity, reinterpreted through theological meaning. Sinkholes formed where underground water had dissolved limestone substrates, creating deceptively solid-looking surfaces that could collapse under weight. These features are particularly dangerous because they give no visual warning. The ground appears normal until the moment of collapse. For a traveling group with livestock, the loss of animals to sudden sinkholes represented not just immediate tragedy, but long-term reduction in food security and wealth. Sandstorms, beyond their respiratory dangers, created disorientation that could separate individuals from the main group, a potentially fatal circumstance. Without landmarks or visibility, even experienced desert travelers could become hopelessly lost within short distances of safety. The biblical pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, whatever its theological interpretation, acknowledges the critical importance of reliable navigation aids in a landscape where wrong directions cost lives. Modern desert travelers equipped with GPS and emergency communications still perish when separated from groups. The Israelites had no technology beyond their accumulated knowledge to prevent similar outcomes. Against these myriad dangers, the Israelites had limited defenses. Campfires deterred some predators but attracted insects and couldn't be maintained constantly given scarce fuel. Vigilance helped with visible threats, but did nothing against microscopic dangers like bacteria in water or food. Traditional knowledge passed through generations provided some protection, but the sheer number and variety of desert hazards meant that no one could anticipate every potential threat. The biblical emphasis on divine protection reflects the psychological and spiritual necessity of finding meaning in an environment where complete physical security was impossible. The biblical narrative includes numerous incidents of death in the wilderness, some attributed to divine punishment, others to natural causes, many to conflicts both internal and external. Modern readers often focus on the theological aspects of these accounts, but they also reflect the historical reality that desert journeys exacted a continuous toll in human lives despite all precautions. The miracle wasn't that some died in the wilderness, but that any survived at all. This harsh reality shaped every aspect of nomadic life. The constant movement that defined the Israelites' desert years wasn't just a spiritual pilgrimage, but a practical necessity. No single location could support such a large population for long. Water sources would be depleted, local vegetation consumed by livestock, waste accumulation would create health hazards, and predators would be attracted by the continuing human presence. Movement wasn't choice, but requirement. The timing and direction of this movement followed patterns developed by desert peoples over millennia. Travel occurred primarily in early morning and late afternoon, avoiding the brutal midday heat. Routes followed known water sources, rather than straight lines. Certain passages were avoided during seasons when flash floods were likely. The biblical account of divine guidance through cloud and fire overlays theological meaning on what would have also been practical migration strategies, governed by environmental realities. The logistics of breaking camp and moving thousands of people, along with their possessions and livestock, represents a monumental organizational challenge, rarely acknowledged in religious readings of the Exodus narrative. Modern military operations with motorized transport and radio communications struggle with similar population movements. The Israelites accomplished this with runners carrying verbal messages, trumpet signals that carried limited information, and social structures that distributed responsibility through tribal and family groupings. When underway, the caravan would stretch for miles, creating special vulnerabilities. Those at the front faced unknown dangers ahead, but had first access to water sources. Those in the middle contended with dust stirred up by thousands of feet ahead of them, but enjoyed some protection from predators. Those at the rear faced the least environmental disruption, but were most vulnerable to falling behind or being picked off by predators following the group. Daily rotation of positions would have been necessary for fairness, but this required sophisticated organizational systems. The physical toll of this constant movement accumulated over time. Modern medical understanding of repetitive stress injuries helps us comprehend what the biblical text leaves unspoken: the chronic pain that would have been the constant companion of desert travelers. Ankles, knees, and hips suffered under the strain of walking on uneven surfaces. Backs and shoulders bore the weight of possessions and sometimes children. Feet developed calluses, but also splits, blisters, and infections that made each step an exercise in pain management. Without modern pain relievers, supportive footwear, or physical therapy, these conditions became chronic, lifelong disabilities that altered the community's human landscape, just as surely as erosion shaped the physical desert. Camp life during periods of relative stability developed its own rhythms. The biblical text describes the Israelite camp as organized by tribe, with the tabernacle at the center. This organization wasn't just religious symbolism, but practical community management, creating defined responsibilities and authorities that maintained order in what could otherwise have devolved into chaos. Each tribe maintained its own section, with further subdivision by clans and families, creating nested circles of identity and responsibility that helped maintain social cohesion under stress. Within this structure, daily life centered on securing basic necessities, but also included the social activities that define human communities regardless of setting. Meals were communal experiences, preparation and consumption both social and sacred acts. The biblical dietary laws, whatever their theological significance, also served practical functions in preventing foodborne illness and establishing shared identity through common practices. Work was constant but social. Women gathered to draw water, prepare food, spin yarn, and weave cloth. These shared labors providing opportunities for conversation, knowledge exchange, and mutual support essential for psychological well-being under stress. Men similarly worked in groups for hunting, herding, construction, and crafts, the cooperative effort both practical and socially reinforcing. What modern people might view as drudgery took on different dimensions in communal settings. The shared joke that lightened the burden, the exchanged wisdom that solved problems, the collective rhythm that made repetitive tasks meditative rather than mindless. Children created their own societies within the larger community, learning essential skills through observation and increasingly responsible participation in adult activities. Their play, though limited by scarce resources and constant danger, would have included improvised toys, simple games, and imaginative reenactments of adult roles, the universal activities of childhood adapted to the harsh reality of desert existence. Childhood in the wilderness wasn't the protected, education-focused experience of modern youth, but rather an accelerated apprenticeship in survival. By age 7 or 8, children would have significant responsibilities in food preparation, water collection, animal care, and siblings supervision, not because parents were harsh, but because survival required everyone's contribution. Education occurred informally through this participation and formally through intentional instruction. The repeated biblical command to teach the law to children indicates an educational system designed to transmit not just practical knowledge, but cultural identity and religious understanding, without written materials for most people. This education relied on oral transmission, memorization, and public recitation, cognitive practices largely lost in our text-based modern world. Stories weren't just entertainment, but vessels carrying essential information coded in memorable narratives. The Exodus story itself, with its detailed geography and survival lessons, functioned as both religious narrative and practical guide to desert living. Governance in this nomadic society balanced centralized authority with distributed responsibility. Moses and the tribal elders made community-wide decisions, but daily management occurred at the level of extended families. The biblical account of Jethro's advice to Moses, appointing judges over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, describes not just judicial efficiency, but a management structure scaled to human cognitive limits, where each leader knew personally those under their authority. This system acknowledged both the necessity of hierarchy in large group management and the human need for direct relationship with authority figures. Conflict resolution required special attention in the close quarters of desert living. Modern humans can often avoid conflict through physical separation, changing jobs, moving neighborhoods, or simply limiting contact with difficult people. In the Israelite camp, avoidance wasn't an option. People lived, traveled, and worked in constant proximity with the same community for years. The biblical laws include detailed provisions for resolving disputes, compensating injuries, and restoring relationships precisely because these functions were essential for community survival. Without effective conflict resolution, the cooperative basis of desert survival would collapse under the weight of accumulated grievances. The biblical narrative records numerous incidents of conflict within the community, complaints about conditions, challenges to leadership, disputes over resources. Modern religious readings often interpret these as spiritual failings, but they also represent the predictable social friction of a stressed population in close quarters. The wonder isn't that conflicts occurred, but that they didn't more frequently devolve into violence that fragmented the community beyond recovery. The social technologies that prevented such fragmentation, formal arbitration, religious ritual as tension release, clear hierarchies of appeal, represent sophisticated adaptations to the psychological pressures of wilderness living. Religious life provided structure and meaning amidst the chaos of nomadic existence. The biblical festivals, Passover, weeks, tabernacles marked time in a setting where conventional calendars had little relevance. These communal celebrations created rhythms of anticipation and fulfillment, of fasting and feasting, that helped maintain psychological equilibrium under constant stress. The religious calendar provided temporal anchors in a lifestyle where days easily blurred into meaningless succession of survival activities. The festivals also reinforced social bonds through shared experience, common ritual, and collective memory, psychological technologies as essential to group survival as water management or predator defense. The Sabbath institution, whatever its theological significance, served crucial practical functions. It provided regular physical rest in a lifestyle of constant labor. It created predictable family time in a community where work often separated household members. It conserved resources by limiting certain types of consumption, and it reinforced social equality by applying to everyone regardless of status, a powerful statement in a world where rest was typically the privilege of the powerful rather than the right of all. The psychological benefit of a guaranteed rest period, arriving with absolute reliability regardless of circumstances, cannot be overstated in a context of otherwise unrelenting survival pressure. The complexity of maintaining religious practices in desert conditions shouldn't be underestimated. The sacrificial system required animals that represented significant resources in an environment of scarcity. Ritual purity laws demanded water usage that competed with survival needs. Sabbath restrictions complicated travel logistics. The biblical narrative acknowledges that some requirements were modified or suspended during the wilderness years precisely because full compliance was incompatible with the realities of desert survival. This pragmatic adaptation within a framework of absolute religious commitment illustrates the sophistication of Israelite social organization under Moses' leadership. Birth, marriage, and death, the universal transitions of human existence, took on particular characteristics in nomadic desert life. The birth occurred without medical support beyond the traditional knowledge of midwives, in conditions of minimal privacy and comfort, with outcomes heavily dependent on the mother's underlying health and previous nutrition. The high infant mortality typical of pre-modern societies would have been exacerbated by desert conditions, with dehydration presenting special dangers to newborns. Birth spacing would have been essential for maternal survival, achieved through extended breastfeeding and possibly herbal contraceptives. Though the biblical emphasis on fertility created complex cultural pressures around reproduction, marriage maintained its fundamental purpose of creating family alliances and ensuring legitimate offspring, but its celebrations would have been constrained by resource limitations. The elaborate feasts and gift exchanges characteristic of settled agricultural communities would have been simplified to accommodate the scarcity economy of desert living. The biblical text mentions little about marriage during the wilderness years, but the ongoing life of the community required this institution to continue functioning despite challenging circumstances. Marriage choices would have been influenced by the need to maintain tribal boundaries, while avoiding harmful degrees of consanguinity in a limited population, a delicate balance requiring sophisticated kinship tracking. Death was a constant presence, handled according to necessities both practical and ritual. The desert environment actually facilitated certain aspects of traditional Jewish burial practices. The arid conditions naturally mummified bodies, reducing disease risk from decomposition. However, the requirement for quick burial, ideally before sunset on the day of death, created logistical challenges during travel periods. The biblical accounts of specific burial locations for important figures like Miriam and Aaron suggest that some deaths necessitated pauses in the journey to properly honor the deceased. For ordinary community members, graves would have been simple, marked perhaps by stone cairns. Their locations remembered primarily through oral tradition rather than durable monuments. The social structure of the Israelite community provided both support and constraint. The extended family unit, what biblical Hebrew calls father's house, I-Bet-A, formed the basic social and economic unit. Multiple related families constituted a clan, and related clans formed tribes. This nested structure created multiple layers of identity and obligation, with each person simultaneously member of family, clan, tribe, and nation. Modern individualism, with its emphasis on personal choice and self-determination, would have been not just unfamiliar, but fundamentally threatening to a social system where survival depended on clear roles and reliable performance of assigned duties. Gender roles in this society were distinct but complementary, shaped by both cultural tradition and survival necessity. Men's responsibilities centered on protection, large animal husbandry, hunting, construction, and community leadership. Women managed food preparation, water collection, textile production, childcare, and family-level healthcare. These divisions weren't absolute circumstances, would sometimes require flexibility, but they provided organizational clarity that facilitated efficient resource use in a context where inefficiency could be fatal. The biblical narrative focuses primarily on male leadership, but archaeological and anthropological evidence from contemporary cultures suggests that women's domestic authority was substantial and respected, particularly in matters directly affecting family welfare. Age likewise created defined roles with associated privileges and responsibilities. Elders commanded respect based on accumulated knowledge essential for community survival, their memories of water sources, navigation landmarks, weather patterns, medicinal plants, and previous group experiences constituted an irreplaceable living library. Children and youth provided labor while progressively assuming greater responsibilities, their energy and adaptability balancing the conservation and caution of age. The middle generations managed current needs while mediating between preservation of tradition and innovation for survival. This age-based division of cognitive and physical labor optimized group resource use while providing meaningful roles across the lifespan. Special relationships formed the connective tissue of this social body. The mentor-apprentice relationship transmitted specialized skills: metalworking, leathercraft, textile production, herbal medicine, ritual practice. The relationship between Moses and Joshua exemplifies this pattern, with the younger man gradually assuming leadership responsibilities under careful guidance. Bonds created non-familial support networks that supplemented kinship obligations. The biblical David-Jonathan relationship, though from a later period, illustrates the depth of these connections in ancient Israelite culture. Marriage alliances connected family groups, creating expanded networks of obligation and support. Each relationship type contributed to a social ecosystem as complex and essential for survival as the physical environment was challenging and threatening. The psychological challenges of desert living equaled or exceeded the physical. Chronic stress from environmental threats, resource scarcity, and interpersonal friction created conditions ripe for mental health deterioration. Modern studies of populations under similar stresses, refugees, disaster survivors, isolated expeditions, document predictable patterns of anxiety, depression, paranoia, and conflict escalation that would have affected the Israelite community as well. The biblical accounts of complaints, rebellion, and irrational behavior likely reflect not just theological failures, but the psychological consequences of extended survival pressure without relief. Coping mechanisms would have included both individual and communal strategies. Personal resilience practices might involve private prayer, skilled handwork as meditative practice, or developing special expertise that provided sense of control and value. Family-level coping would center on maintaining normal routines despite abnormal circumstances, celebrating small pleasures, and preserving private jokes and stories that reinforced family identity. Community-wide coping included religious rituals that provided emotional catharsis, storytelling that contextualized current hardships within meaningful narrative, and leadership that balanced acknowledgement of difficulties with confidence in ultimate success. The role of Moses within this social ecosystem merits special attention. As portrayed in biblical narrative, he functioned simultaneously as prophet-y religious authority, judge-y legal authority, and tribal leaders political authority, a concentration of responsibility virtually unknown in modern organizational structures. This multifaceted leadership role required extraordinary personal resources, and the text acknowledges moments when these demands exceeded even Moses' capacity, as when Jethro observes him overwhelmed by judicial responsibilities, or when he strikes the rock in frustrated anger rather than speaking to it as instructed. Moses' relationship with the people displays the complexity inherent in leadership during extended crisis. He serves variously as their advocate before God, their judge in disputes, their teacher in law, their strategist in travel, and occasionally their target when frustrations reach breaking point. The biblical portrayal is notably realistic in showing both his remarkable strengths and human limitations, his patience and his anger, his faithfulness and his momentary doubts, his willingness to intercede for rebellious followers, and his occasional exasperation with their complaints. This complex characterization suggests historical memory of a real leader, navigating impossible demands rather than idealized hagiography. The relationship between Moses and his biological family illustrates the tension between public role and private connection. His sister Miriam, described as a prophetess in her own right, at one point challenges his unique authority along with their brother Aaron. His wife Zipporah, a Midianite, represents cultural difference within the leadership family itself. His sons receive remarkably little mention compared to his public role, suggesting perhaps that leadership responsibilities diminished family connections, a pattern familiar to modern leaders in high-stress positions. These family dynamics humanize the towering figure of Moses while illustrating how public leadership roles strain private relationships. Moses' developmental relationship with the people tracks a pattern recognizable in modern group dynamics during extended stress. Initial high regard during the dramatic exodus from Egypt gives way to complaint and challenge as desert hardships accumulate. Repeated cycles of rebellion, consequence, repentance, and restoration create a complex group learning process. By the end of the wilderness period, according to the biblical chronology, an entire generation has passed, with only those born in the wilderness or very young during the Exodus surviving to enter the Promised Land. This generational shift creates a people shaped entirely by wilderness experience rather than Egyptian slavery, psychologically prepared for the challenges of conquest and settlement in ways their parents were not. The relationship between the Israelites and other peoples encountered during the wilderness years added another dimension of social complexity. The biblical narrative mentions various interactions, some hostile, some neutral, some supportive. The Amalekites attacked the vulnerable Israelite stragglers, leading to ongoing enmity. The Edomites refused passage through their territory despite kinship connections through the Jacob-Esau relationship. The Midianites, connected to Moses through his marriage to Zipporah, initially appear as allies but later become adversaries. These inter-group dynamics added political and military dimensions to the already complex challenges of desert survival. Trade relationships would have been essential despite the biblical emphasis on divine provision. No community, however self-sufficient, can produce every necessity, particularly specialized items like metal tools. The Israelites would have traded with settled communities and other nomadic groups encountered during their journey, exchanging animal products, textiles, and labor for tools, weapons, and food items unavailable in the desert. These economic relationships required diplomatic skills, cultural awareness, and fair dealing. Social technologies as vital as fire, making, or water finding for desert survival. Cultural integrity amid these diverse influences represented another social challenge. The Israelites had left Egypt with a mixed multitude, according to the biblical account, not just descendants of Jacob, but others who chose to join the Exodus. They encountered various peoples during their desert sojourn. Each contact presented both opportunity and threat, new knowledge and resources, but also potential cultural dilution. The strong emphasis on distinctive practices, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, unique religious rituals, served not just theological purposes, but social boundary maintenance, preserving group identity amid potentially dissolving influences. Modern immigrant communities employ similar strategies of selective practice to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to new environments. The relationship between the people and the divine, as portrayed in biblical narrative, provided the ultimate social context for the wilderness experience. God appears as covenant partner, provider, lawgiver, protector, and judge, an active presence rather than abstract concept. Whether understood historically as direct supernatural intervention or as human interpretation of natural events through theological lens. This relationship provided essential psychological framework for understanding suffering, maintaining hope, and creating meaning in an otherwise potentially meaningless experience of hardship. Modern disaster survivors often report similar meaning, making through religious interpretation as critical to psychological resilience. This divinely oriented worldview created a distinctive understanding of causality and responsibility, what modern perspectives might view as random misfortune or natural consequence. The biblical narrative often interprets as divine response to human action. This framework isn't simple superstition, but a sophisticated moral cosmology that connects human choices with larger patterns of order and disorder. It creates both burden and comfort, the burden of moral responsibility for suffering, but also the comfort of cosmic meaning, rather than chaotic randomness. In a wilderness where human control over circumstances was minimal, this perspective provided a sense of indirect control through moral action and divine relationship. The biblical narrative of the Israelites' wilderness journey includes several miraculous events that transcend ordinary desert experience. These divine interventions, whatever their historical interpretation, address the fundamental survival challenges that would otherwise have made the journey impossible for such a large group. The most significant of these miracles directly provided the essentials that the desert environment could not supply in sufficient quantity. Food and water. Manna, described as a fine flake-like substance that appeared on the ground each morning with the dew, represents the most sustained miracle in the biblical account. Exodus describes it as white like coriander seed, with a taste like wafers made with honey or fresh oil. This mysterious substance allegedly sustained the Israelites for 40 years, providing daily nourishment in an environment that could never naturally support such a population through conventional foraging or agriculture. The text includes specific instructions for its collection, gathering each morning, taking only what was needed for the day, collecting double portions before the Sabbath, creating a food system that reinforced both trust in divine provision and the community's distinctive religious practices. Various natural explanations have been proposed for the manna phenomenon, from plant secretions, like tamarisk tree resin, to lichen species that can detach and be blown by wind, to insect secretions that crystallize in desert conditions. None fully account for the quantity, regularity, and nutritional completeness described in the biblical narrative, which presents manna as explicitly supernatural rather than an unusual natural phenomenon. For modern listeners comfortable with scientific explanations, these natural theories might seem satisfying, but they often overlook the logistical impossibility of feeding thousands of people adequate calories through such limited sources. The biblical writers, aware of desert realities, presented manna as miracle precisely because they understood that natural desert processes could not support their numbers. The description of manna includes practical details that ring true to desert experience. It had to be gathered early before the sun grew hot and melted it. It spoiled when kept overnight, except before Sabbath. It could be prepared through various cooking methods: boiled, baked into bread, ground into flour. These details suggest memory of an actual food source rather than purely symbolic narrative. Some scholars suggest the manna account may combine memories of occasional natural desert food sources with theological interpretation of how these limited resources consistently sustained a large population, transforming unusual but natural provisions into miraculous sustenance through divine multiplication. The quail episodes represent another miraculous food provision, though more occasional than the daily manna. The biblical account describes massive flocks of quail descending on the camp, providing abundant meat to a protein-hungry population. These accounts align with natural migration patterns. Quail do cross the Sinai Peninsula during seasonal migrations, sometimes in large numbers, and exhausted birds landing after long flights might indeed be easily captured. However, the biblical narrative emphasizes both the timing and quantity as supernatural, with birds literally falling around the camp in response to complaints about dietary monotony. The quail incident also includes a sobering element missing from the manna narrative. Those who gorged themselves on meat suffered a plague as divine punishment for their greed. This may reflect historical memory of food poisoning from improperly preserved meat, especially if large quantities of birds were suddenly available with inadequate preparation facilities. Modern desert travelers who encounter sudden abundance after scarcity sometimes experience similar digestive crises when overconsumption meat systems adapted to minimal intake. The biblical writers interpret this natural consequence through theological lens, seeing divine purpose in what might otherwise seem random misfortune. Water miracles appear repeatedly in the wilderness narrative, addressing the desert's most immediate survival challenge. The striking of the rock at Horeb, where Moses produces water to quench the people's thirst, provides the most famous example. Similar incidents occur at Marah, where bitter water is made sweet, and Meribah, where water again comes from rock, but with controversy over Moses' actions. These accounts may reflect knowledge of desert hydrology. Certain rock formations in the Sinai do contain water sources that can be accessed by someone who knows where to strike or dig. Flash floods can suddenly fill dry wadis with water that persists in underground channels even after surface flow disappears. As with manna, these potentially natural phenomena are presented as explicitly supernatural in timing, quantity, and causation. Modern desert travelers occasionally discover unexpected water sources through lucky coincidence or desperate searching. The biblical narrative transforms such experiences into direct divine response to human need and prayer. The theological framework creates meaning beyond mere survival. The water isn't just hydration, but tangible evidence of divine care, transforming what might be seen as lucky survival into purposeful journey under supernatural protection. What makes these accounts compelling isn't just their survival utility, but their psychological resonance. The wilderness generation experienced profound insecurity, former slaves without homeland, wandering a hostile environment, dependent on a leader's vision of a destination they'd never seen. The experience of receiving precisely what was needed, exactly when needed, created not just physical sustenance, but psychological reinforcement that their journey had purpose and protection. Modern disaster survivors report similar psychological benefits when unexpected aid arrives at crucial moments. The material support matters, but the sense of being remembered and cared for provides equally essential emotional sustenance. The miracle of guidance through pillar of cloud by day and fire by night addresses another critical desert survival challenge: navigation. Before GPS, satellite imagery, or even accurate maps, desert travel required specialized knowledge, typically developed through generations of experience in a particular region. The Israelites, newly escaped from Egypt, lacked this generational knowledge base. The supernatural guidance described in Exodus provided both practical direction and psychological reassurance, visible evidence of divine presence, leading through a featureless landscape where wrong turns meant death. Naturalistic explanations suggest the account might describe leaders carrying fire signals on poles, a known ancient navigation technique reinterpreted through theological lens. Others suggest volcanic activity in the region might have created visible phenomena interpreted as divine guidance. Whatever the historical basis, the account acknowledges the fundamental reality that successful navigation through the Sinai wilderness required something beyond ordinary human capability for a group the size of Israel without previous desert experience. The miracle of protected clothing and unworn sandals, mentioned toward the end of the wilderness period, addresses the practical reality of material deterioration in harsh desert conditions. Deuteronomy states that during the 40 years of wandering, the Israelites' clothing did not wear out, nor did their feet swell. This supernatural preservation of material goods acknowledges the reality that normal desert conditions rapidly degrade textiles, leather, and human tissues. The practical impossibility of replacing clothing and footwear for thousands of people in a resource-scarce environment would have created an insurmountable problem without either supernatural intervention or extensive trade networks, not mentioned in the biblical account. Beyond these specific miracles addressing physical needs, the wilderness narrative includes dramatic supernatural encounters that addressed spiritual and psychological needs. The Sinai Covenant experience, with its thunder, lightning, smoke, and divine voice, provided authoritative foundation for the community's legal and religious system. Whatever its historical basis, this dramatic theophany created a shared reference point that legitimized Moses' leadership and the legal structure he implemented. Modern communities under stress similarly benefit from foundational experiences that unify group identity and purpose, whether religious revivals, revolutionary moments, or shared survival of disaster. The supernatural elements of the wilderness narrative have often been the focus of both religious devotion and skeptical criticism, but this dichotomy misses their anthropological significance. These accounts, whether understood as historical reports of actual miracles or as theological interpretations of natural events, acknowledge the practical reality that desert survival for such a large group over extended time required extraordinary intervention. The biblical writers, familiar with desert realities, didn't insert miraculous elements to make a mundane journey seem special, but rather to explain how an otherwise impossible journey could have occurred at all. Moses' leadership throughout these miraculous events displays a complex relationship with divine power. He serves as human instrument, striking the rock, lifting his staff, giving instructions for manna collection, but the power clearly comes from beyond him. This pattern creates both authority and accountability, legitimizing his leadership while preventing it from becoming absolute or self-sufficient. The one instance where he appears to claim power for himself, "Must we bring water for you out of this rock?" results in divine rebuke and significant personal consequence. Unable to enter the promised land despite 40 years of faithful leadership, this balanced portrayal of human and divine action creates a leadership model that prevents both despair and arrogance. The acknowledgement of supernatural power means that seemingly impossible challenges don't lead to despair, while the limited human role prevents the pride that attributes success entirely to human capability. This balanced perspective creates psychological resilience, particularly suited to the extreme conditions of desert survival, where both hopelessness and overconfidence lead to fatal errors. Modern extreme environment expeditions to Antarctica, remote mountains, or deep oceans often develop similar perspectives, acknowledging both human skill and the humbling power of natural forces beyond control. The wilderness journey's physical challenges were matched by significant social and spiritual tests that revealed the community's character under pressure. The biblical narrative includes multiple instances of complaint, rebellion, and leadership challenge that threatened the group's cohesion and survival. These episodes, often interpreted primarily as spiritual failures, also represent predictable social dynamics under extreme stress, where the fundamental human covenant that leaders will ensure survival needs appears broken. The complaint about water at Marah and later at Meribah expresses the most immediate survival fear. The golden calf incident reveals the psychological insecurity created when established leadership appears absent. Moses on the mountain and familiar religious forms, Egyptian practices, offer comforting alternatives to the demanding new covenant. The rebellion of Korah challenges the concentration of power in Moses and Aaron, expressing political grievances wrapped in religious language. The report of the spies and subsequent refusal to enter Canaan demonstrates how fear can override both divine assurance and practical opportunity when a community's psychological reserves are depleted by extended hardship. These rebellion narratives serve multiple functions within the biblical account. Theologically, they demonstrate divine patience and the consequences of faithlessness. Historically, they preserve memory of the genuine social challenges faced during the wilderness period. Psychologically, they acknowledge the predictable human responses to prolonged stress and uncertainty. And practically, they create an instruction manual for future generations facing similar challenges, both warning of common failure patterns and providing models for leadership response. Moses' responses to these rebellions demonstrate sophisticated leadership under pressure. He frequently intercedes with God on the people's behalf. Even when their complaints target him personally, he implements practical solutions while reinforcing spiritual perspectives, addressing both immediate needs and underlying meaning. He delegates authority where appropriate, but intervenes directly in core threats to community identity and purpose. He balances consequences for rebellion with pathways to restoration and continued participation in the community. These leadership strategies remain relevant for modern crisis management, where addressing both practical needs and meaning making remains essential for group cohesion under stress. The 40-year time span of the wilderness journey created a transitional generation shaped entirely by desert experience rather than Egyptian slavery. Those who entered the promised land had either been born in the wilderness or were young children during the Exodus. Their identities formed through the unique combination of hardship and miracle that characterized the desert years. This generational transformation, explicitly described as divine intention in the biblical narrative, represents a profound psychological insight. Some experiences are so deeply traumatizing that a new beginning requires not just geographical relocation, but generational transition. Modern refugee studies confirm similar patterns, where complete adaptation to new circumstances often only fully manifests in the generation born after displacement. This wilderness-formed generation possessed characteristics their parents lacked. They had never known settled life or experienced agency, destroying slavery. Their entire existence had demonstrated both the harsh consequences of poor choices and the sustaining experience of divine provision. They had witnessed the establishment of legal and religious systems that would define their community identity for generations. They had developed the hardiness and adaptability that desert survival required. These qualities prepared them for the challenges of conquest and settlement in ways their parents' generation, despite physically leaving Egypt, remained psychologically unable to embrace. The leadership transition from Moses to Joshua represents another critical preparation for entering the promised land. Despite Moses' extraordinary qualities and divine validation, the biblical narrative insists that new circumstances require new leadership. Joshua embodies qualities specifically suited to the conquest period military experience, first-hand knowledge of the promised territory from his scouting mission, and direct mentorship by Moses that provided both training and legitimacy. This leadership transition acknowledges that different phases of community life require different leadership strengths, a principle that remains relevant for modern organizational development during major transitions. As the wilderness period concludes, Moses delivers final addresses preserved in Deuteronomy, part historical review, part legal instruction, part prophetic warning about future challenges. These speeches look both backward and forward, connecting the wilderness experience with the settled life to come. They explicitly warn against forgetting the lessons of desert vulnerability, once surrounded by agricultural abundance. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness. This warning identifies a fundamental human pattern, the prosperity that creates physical ease often produces spiritual and psychological amnesia about the experiences and relationships that enabled survival during hardship. The biblical narrative insists that the wilderness period, despite its hardships, contained essential wisdom that must be preserved after its conclusion. The entire system of memorials, Sabbaths, festivals, and recitations prescribed in biblical law serves partly to prevent this forgetting, requiring regular remembrance of both the vulnerability experienced in wilderness and the provision that sustained through it. These wilderness memories shaped Israelite identity long after the actual desert experience ended. The biblical prophets repeatedly invoke wilderness imagery when calling the people back to covenant faithfulness. Hosea describes God alluring unfaithful Israel back to the wilderness to restore proper relationship. Jeremiah recalls the wilderness period as a honeymoon time of pure devotion. I remember the devotion of your youth, how as a bride you loved me and followed me through the wilderness. Amos and others envision a future restoration that recapitulates elements of wilderness experience. These persistent references demonstrate how thoroughly the desert journey, with its combination of vulnerability and divine encounter, became the defining paradigm for authentic spiritual experience in biblical thought. For modern listeners, the wilderness narrative offers perspectives increasingly relevant in a world facing environmental degradation, resource scarcity, and population displacement. The biblical account doesn't romanticize wilderness hardship, but neither does it present vulnerability as meaningless suffering. Instead, it portrays extreme challenge as context for both practical innovation and spiritual transformation. The desert becomes not just hostile environment but classroom, forge, and meeting place with the divine, physically threatening but spiritually and psychologically generative when navigated within community and transcendent meaning. The accounts focus on communal rather than individual response to scarcity challenges modern Western individualism, which often frames survival as competitive rather than cooperative. The wilderness generation survived not through exceptional individual heroism, but through systems of mutual support, shared resources, and collective meaning, making that ensured no one faced desert challenges in isolation. As modern communities increasingly confront climate disruptions, resource competitions, and mass migrations, these ancient patterns of communal resilience offer alternatives to both fatalistic despair and hyper-individualistic survivalism. The spiritual framework of the wilderness narrative similarly challenges contemporary assumptions that meaning is entirely self-constructed or that hardship lacks purpose beyond random misfortune. Without requiring literal acceptance of every supernatural element, the biblical account offers a perspective that hardship, while not desirable, can become transformative when interpreted within larger patterns of meaning and purpose. This perspective creates psychological resilience by transforming victims of circumstance into participants in meaningful journey, an approach increasingly validated by modern psychological research on post-traumatic growth and resilience factors. For those with religious commitments, the wilderness narrative offers particularly rich resources for navigating periods of spiritual disorientation and apparent divine absence. The biblical account doesn't present an idealized journey of constant spiritual high points, but rather acknowledges the cycles of confidence and doubt, obedience and rebellion, clarity and confusion that characterize actual spiritual experience, especially under stress. It portrays both divine faithfulness and human struggle with unprecedented honesty, creating space for authentic spirituality that encompasses the full range of human response to both divine presence and apparent absence. Even the account's supernatural elements, often dismissed in secular contexts as primitive superstition, offer psychological insights when understood as phenomenological rather than empirical claims. The experience of unexpected provision precisely meeting critical needs creates powerful impressions of being looked after by forces beyond oneself, whether interpreted as divine intervention, natural synchronicity, or statistical coincidence. The psychological impact of such experiences, the sense of being remembered and cared for even in extreme isolation, creates resilience regardless of the metaphysical framework used to explain them. The wilderness narrative takes these universal human experiences of coincidental provision and integrates them into coherent meaning, making rather than dismissing them as subjective delusions. The 40-year wilderness period appears in later biblical literature as both historical reference point and spiritual metaphor, the archetypal journey through hardship toward promise and fulfillment. Early Christian writers adopted this metaphor, viewing human life as wilderness pilgrimage toward heavenly homeland. Medieval mystics used desert imagery to describe spiritual desolation that paradoxically enables deeper divine encounter. Modern spiritual writers continue finding relevance in wilderness symbolism for experiences of disorientation, testing, and transformation. This persistent metaphorical power suggests the narrative touches universal human experiences of discomfort, vulnerability, and unexpected growth through challenging transitions. For you, lying comfortably in bed, listening to this account of ancient hardship, the contrast between your circumstances and theirs creates perspective that facilitates both gratitude and reflection. The simple acts you take for granted, turning on a tap for clean water, adjusting room temperature with the touch of a button, opening a refrigerator stocked with food from around the world, would seem like miracles to the wilderness generation. Your mattress, pillows, and climate control create comfort they could scarcely imagine during their 40 years of hard ground, improvised shelter, and exposure to elements. This contrast isn't meant to induce guilt, but rather awareness of the extraordinary material abundance that forms the unexamined background of modern life. Yet, despite material differences, certain fundamental human experiences remain unchanged. You still navigate uncertainty about the future. You still struggle with questions of meaning and purpose. You still experience tension between individual desire and community responsibility. You still face moments of loss, grief, and disorientation that no material comfort can fully address. And you still encounter unexpected provision, connection, and insight that arrive precisely when needed, raising questions about whether the universe is indifferent or ultimately benevolent despite its harshness. In these universal human experiences, the ancient wilderness narrative still speaks across millennia of cultural change. The Israelites eventually reached their promised land, not through supernatural teleportation, but through placing one foot in front of another, day after day, following what guidance was available, sustaining each other through community, and maintaining core identity despite changing circumstances. This ordinary heroism, performed under extraordinary pressure, forms the heart of the wilderness narrative beneath its more dramatic, miraculous elements. Modern readers facing their own wilderness periods, whether literal displacement, career disruption, relationship dissolution, health crisis, or spiritual disorientation, can find in this ancient account both practical wisdom for communal survival and psychological framework for maintaining purpose through extended uncertainty. As you drift towards sleep, consider what wilderness you might be traversing in your own life, what familiar securities have been left behind, what unknown territory lies ahead, what resources seem inadequate for the journey. The ancient narrative offers assurance that such wilderness periods, while genuinely difficult, need not be meaningless wandering. They can become, with proper attention and community support, transformative passages between what was and what will be, generating qualities and insights unavailable through more comfortable routes. This perspective doesn't romanticize suffering, but rather insists that difficulty, when neither denied nor given ultimate power, can become the unlikely context for both practical resilience and spiritual depth. The wilderness journey's final lesson may be its most counterintuitive, that what initially appears as directionless wandering, meaningless hardship, or endlessly deferred arrival can ultimately be revealed as necessary preparation for destinations we could not otherwise inhabit and purposes we could not otherwise fulfill. This recognition rarely comes during the wilderness itself, where limited perspective makes each day's survival the horizon of possibility. The meaning emerges retrospectively, when settled in the promised land, looking back across territory whose harsh contours shaped precisely the qualities needed for present challenges. For the Israelites, 40 years of desert hardship created exactly the community required for their historical purpose. Your own wilderness, whatever its nature and duration, may be forming qualities equally essential for purposes not yet revealed. Let this ancient story of survival against impossible odds, of provision amid scarcity, of purpose discovered through disorientation, ease you toward restful sleep. The God who led them through literal wilderness has not abandoned those facing metaphorical deserts of uncertainty, loss, or transition. The same guidance, provision, and meaning-making remains available, though perhaps in forms less dramatic than pillars of fire or bread from heaven. As consciousness fades, release anxiety about whatever wilderness you face, trusting that its seemingly meaningless hardships may be forming precisely the qualities needed for destinations and purposes not yet visible from your current vantage point. Like the ancient Israelites, you need not see the entire journey to take the next step through your own wilderness toward promise and fulfillment.